Well, the focus of this particular session, and we've titled it, The Nature and Extent of Homicide in South Africa. And obviously we don't expect the speakers to cover all these particular topics, but that the abstracts that they submitted spoke to this particular topic. So we're going to get really kind of tasters of what we know about the extent of homicide throughout South Africa. Obviously, there is a focus here on the Western Cape because that's where most research is happening, and that research that's happening that's being presented at this particular conference. But let me just give a little bit of information about our speakers. Nancy Hornsby, she has an MA in research psychology, neuropsychology from the University of Cape Town, and she is a scientist at the South African Medical Research Council. She's part of the Violence, Injury and Peace Research Unit, which is a collaboration between UNISA and the UNISA Institute for Social and Health Sciences and the Medical Research Council. Her interests lie in pediatric traumatic brain injury and the etiology, predictors of injury severity. And she's quite intimately involved in the National Injury Mortality Surveillance System, or NIMS, that those of us who do research on homicide and injuries make use of their data, so it provides a really good resource to researchers that are out there. And then Mandy Albus is a biological anthropologist, and she's a lecturer and researcher at Stellenbosch University in the Anatomy and Histology division. She's in the process of completing her PhD in biological anthropology. And then Courtney Clark is currently a final year master's student in the Division of Forensic Medicine and Toxicology at UCT. She holds a BSc in genetics and archaeology, and an honors in cellular biology, also from UCT. And she's completing her MPhil in biomedical forensic sciences. Her interests include blunt force trauma and gender-based violence. So how things are going to work, I'm going to invite the speakers to speak for about 15 minutes. We're going to have all three presentations, and then we're going to open up the floor for questions and comments. So I'd like to invite the first speaker up. Thank you.
Right, thanks for that introduction. So I'm going to be presenting on homicide trends in South Africa, looking at findings from rural and urban settings across the period of 2007 to 2011. So a quick overview of the presentation. I'll do a brief background, then I'll give the main objectives of the study and method. I'll discuss the key findings, make some concluding remarks, and then just shortly go into some of the limitations that emerged. So just very briefly, in terms of the review of the literature, though it is a highly preventable, homicide deaths do remain a public health concern, both nationally and internationally. So according to the WHO Violence Report of 2014, nearly 1.4 million people die worldwide as a result of violence. And that's violence in its various forms. So interpersonal violence, self-directed violence, collective violence. And globally, low to middle income countries account for about 90% of all violent deaths. And typically, a high risk of homicide is associated with firearms as the mode of death and injury. In a recent paper by Macroscopic and his colleagues showed the same trend with a higher rate of firearm homicides, but their findings showed a year-on-year decrease in firearm rates and homicide rates overall for the period 2001 to 2005. And they also made use of the NIMS data. Then later NIMS data, based on 2007 data, report sharp objects actually. So there we see a different picture emerging, where sharp objects emerge as the leading cause, followed by firearms. Then in terms of regional differences, so Geographical variations have been found in homicides, with more homicides concentrated in urban areas than rural areas. And this is usually associated with the risk factors associated with the more urban areas that are densely populated, more gang involvement, organized crime. So that have been offered as some of the factors associated with a high risk. And in terms of risk profile for homicide, victim characteristics, so the age, the race, and the sex of the victims, as well as perpetrator characteristics, are associated with risk for violent deaths. And globally, males have been found to be 4 times more likely than females to be victims of a homicide. And in terms of age, young to adult males, usually aged 15 to 44 years, are usually at higher risk of being victims to homicide. And then in terms of the South African content, a similar profile emerges with young to adult black males being at a high risk. And then lastly, seasonal, so month of death and temporal factors like day of death and time of the week have also been found to be associated with homicides. Usually it's during the nighttime period, over weekends, and that's been found nationally and internationally, that we find to be significant contributing factors to homicide. So just the main objectives of the study was to, as the title explained, to explore the urban and rural variations in homicides in South Africa, and then also to identify and adjust for a range of effects. So that would include victim characteristics and the seasonal and temporal factors that have been found to be associated with homicide. So the method we followed was we used the time series mortality data from the National Injury Mortality System, surveillance system, which is jointly managed by the Violence and Injury Unit with the South African Medical Research Council and UNISA. And then the data was analyzed retrospectively for the period 2007 to 2011. And we chose that period because we had better coverage across Gauteng and Mpumalanga, with Gauteng being mainly urban and Mpumalanga being rural. Then we also obtained population estimates from Stats SA for the calculation of crude population-based homicide rates. And then considering the public health burden of firearm homicide specifically, we decided to use a binary outcome grouping where firearms were compared to non-firearm homicides. In terms of statistical analysis, because we are using secondary data, we have the problem of missing data. So for power of analysis, the data was imputed and we performed sensitivity analysis to check that integrity of factors and variables were maintained. Then binary logistic regression using generalized linear modeling was used to assess urban and rural differences and also significant contributing factors associated with homicide risk. And then finally, we used receiver operating characteristics to check for model fit. So, key findings overall, higher homicide rates were associated for Gauteng, which is mainly urban, as I said earlier, versus Mpumalanga. And you can see across the years, it's generally the rates are higher for Gauteng, which had an overall sample of, I think, 18,360. I don't have it there. And Mpumalanga, which was 4,620 cases reported. Then, in terms of the comparison of non-firearm versus firearm injury, we see a different picture emerging here with non-firearm injury actually being the leading cause in both Gauteng and Mpumalanga. So this was similar to 2008 findings from the NIMS-DART report. And these are population-based rates. Then with the test of model effects using the GLM, we found all of the factors under investigation, so year of death, the race of the victim, sex of the victim, age, and then the temporal and seasonal factors. All of these factors were significant contributors to the risk of homicide. For Gauteng, similarly for Mpumalanga, all of these factors emerged as significant except for month of death. So we did not find seasonal variation to be significant. Then for Gauteng, just very briefly overall, a high risk of homicide was found among young to adult males, aged 15 to 44, and older adult males, aged 45 to 65 years. And here we find the high risk associated with white males. So a different picture emerged from previous findings where black males were found to be more at risk of being victim to homicide. And a relative risk of homicide was found to be higher during the winter seasonal periods. Over the night times, usually between 6 and 11 p.m. and over weekend periods. And similarly for Mpumalanga, a higher risk of homicide was found among young adult males, aged 15 to 44, and older males, and again, high risk associated with being white. Then in terms of seasonal factors, seasonal and temporal factors, seasonality was not, like I said earlier, was not statistically significant, but it was found to be a high relative risk associated with the nighttime period, again, between 6 and 11 and over weekend periods. Then just some final concluding remarks. Non-firearm homicides have emerged as a bigger burden than firearm homicides, so we're seeing a divergent trend from previous findings. And then victim characteristics like age, sex, and race of victim are important contributing factors when we want to understand the risk associated with homicide, as well as the seasonal and temporal factors that I've discussed in the presentation. And these factors need to be considered when designing and implementing well-integrated interventions and strategies. And in addition to that, other important factors need to be considered, like the proximal risks. So, for example, alcohol consumption and distal contributors, for example, social deprivation, unemployment, when designing such intervention strategies. Then just some limitations that emerge from this study. The NIMS-DART does not provide full coverage for Gauteng. We don't have coverage for Pretoria mortuaries at the moment. And Pretoria comprises a large number of the Gauteng population. So that was a major limitation. And then it also doesn't allow for assessing offender characteristics, so the perpetrator typology, or individual and environmental factors specific to violent behavior, like I said earlier, unemployment, which might be associated with more risk or more incidents of violent crimes. And then lastly, blood alcohol concentration data was not available for this period due to a backlog in laboratory testing. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, man. Thanks so much, Nancy. I think that was a really good scene setter for us. It's kind of given us a really good idea of the nature of the kind of prevalence of homicide. I know it's focusing on two particular areas, but the dynamics in the rest of the country are very similar to this. So thank you very much for giving us that good scene setter. I'd now like to invite Mandy if you'd like to come up and make a presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am going to talk about the prevalence of interpersonal violence-related skeletal trauma in a sample specifically to the Western Cape. Violence is considered as a major health hazard worldwide, and it's a critical burden to society, as you all know, as well as the healthcare systems. And interpersonal violence is a great social problem in South Africa. It exceeds the global averages at the moment still. Violence-related trauma or multiple studies have concluded that violence-related trauma is more prevalent in males than females, and it commonly occurs in ages between 24 and 35, although you'll see it much older. That's interesting to my skeletal collection. Physical injuries, violence related to physical injuries range from minor bruising to skeletal fractures to even multi-system trauma that may end in fatality. According to the global trend, interpersonal violence is a major cause of death in developed countries, while motor vehicle accidents or MVAs are a major cause of deaths in developing countries. Risk factors that for interpersonal violence includes low socioeconomic circumstances, unemployment, low levels of education, alcohol and drug abuse. Some people believe that beating of a spouse is beneficial to the recipient. And more than 73% of domestic violence events tend to involve repeat offending. It causes multiple trauma sites and at various stages of healing on our skeletal collections. And it's been found in a study that only 16% of assaults is observed on skeletal collections. Location of healed trauma skeletal material can either be blunt force trauma or sharp force trauma. It should be carefully assessed to determine whether an individual has been involved in incidents of interpersonal violence. It commonly will result in trauma to the upper extremities as well as the facial or skull bones. And in motor vehicle accidents, it will more be skull as well as lower extremities. We are privileged to have a comprehensive skeletal collection at our campus, at Tygerberg campus, Stellenbosch University. And it offers the opportunity to study physical properties of individuals specifically populating the Western Cape area. These skeletons derive from cadavers. As you all know, we use it as anatomy dissection for training of medical students. And after the students have completed their dissections, these cadavers will be processed and it will be taken into the ossuary, get numbered and everything. And most of these individuals in our skeletal population is from the 20th century. The oldest one was born in 1885 and it's still placed, new skeletons are placed in there regularly. It's a unique collection because it's the largest collection of the colored or the mixed population that we found in South Africa, as well as in the world because of the genetic variation that's unique to this area. We don't have any forensic cases because we cannot embalm post-mortem dissected bodies. The embalming fluid must be circulated in a closed blood vessel system, and as soon as pathology post-mortem has been done on it, we cannot use it. This study has been ethically cleared by Stellenbosch University, and limited knowledge exists at the moment on the prevalence of violence-related trauma and the osteological implication thereof in a Western Cape population. That's why we aim to determine the prevalence of violence-related trauma within this Kirsten collection with the focus on interpersonal violence. Macroscopic analysis was conducted. One honor student did the skull and mandible, Leandri De Beer, and the other one, Nastasia Kutsia, did a postcranial study. 308 of the skull and mandible was observed, and postcranial 284 of the skeletal collection was observed. We, as biological anthropologists, use external markings on the skeletal material to determine the trauma history of each individual, and we do it by observing with the macroscopical as well as Lodox or X-ray methods. And if we look macroscopically at it, we use a magnifying glass and a fluorescent light to see properly what's going on there. The skull bones included the frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal, nasal, zygomatic arch, as well as the maxilla. And the long bones included all the long bones of the body. We also checked for type of trauma. Was it blunt force trauma or sharp force trauma that caused this, as well as where this trauma took place. Was it which skeletal element, which area on the skeletal element, and what side of the body was affected. And the results came on the cranium and the mandible. 54% of these skeletons had trauma, mostly healed blunt force trauma, because sharp force trauma tend to end as a forensic case usually. More males than females were involved, and if we look at the three ancestry populations we have, more colored, followed by black, followed by white people. Left was more involved than the right-hand side. If we look at the postcranial part, observations showed that 59% of these individuals were involved in trauma. Again, blunt force trauma, 99%, almost all of these were blunt force trauma. And again, males were more prevalent than females, colored much more than the black and the white populations, and again, left more than right, except for the radius and the fibula, that was both equally, as well as the tibia, that was more on the right side than the left side. Multiple cranial trauma, there was a statistical significant correlation between the prevalence of trauma observed on at least two cranial bones at a time. So if you look at the frontal and parietal, it was significantly different, prevalent that both can be traumatized, as well if you look at the maxilla and the nasal areas. And on the postcranial part, 48 or 46.8% of these individuals had multiple trauma sites. An interesting fact was that there was 82 individuals with multiple rib fractures. And again, males had more prevalence of multiple fractures than females. This is just a few examples of healed calluses. That is ulna, humerus, and a femur, and the femur even had some surgical intervention. And if you look at the cranial part here, there's a glass embedded that even stayed behind after processing, and a pellet in the maxilla of this individual. Nasal trauma, we had quite a few nasal trauma patients, skeletal collection, different areas of trauma, as well as different timing of the healing time that took place. To show you the difference between blunt force trauma and sharp force trauma on the skeletal collection, that will be a sharp force trauma by a panga, for example, and that can be a blunt force trauma by a knopkierie. And interpersonal violence-related skeletal trauma are commonly associated with a high frequency of blunt force trauma, as we saw in our skeletal collection. A high frequency of distal ulnar trauma is seen in this study as well, and a high frequency of rib fractures, as you saw in this as well. Multiple trauma sites were sizable in the study, and as well as the low socioeconomic circumstances of most of these individuals. We didn't see that much on the middle radial fractures. That was quite low. So that's all the others give you an indication of high evidence of suggestive interpersonal violence. And again, as I said, males were more involved than females, and the colored population were more involved than the other two populations. This study showed a high prevalence of trauma in the skeletal material. However, it still remains that trauma caused by interpersonal violence may not be distinguishable from accidental injuries, and the mechanism of the injury can only be speculated. Therefore, the findings recommend a cross-validation with medical records that we do not have, and so that's the only way how we can determine the true mechanism of this injury. The study intends to contribute to the literature on the prevalence of trauma and interpersonal violence within the Western Cape communities, and the impact thereof on the social and economic well-being of individuals in this region. I just want to acknowledge these people. Thank you.
Blunt force trauma today. The Salt River Mortuary is classified as an M6 academic facility, which means that it processes over 2,000 cases a year, as well as provides training and teaching to the University of Cape Town. It services the West Metropole of the City of Cape Town, which receives cases from the districts shown in the map, excepting for Tygerberg and the Eastern District. This study is part of an ongoing retrospective review of blunt force trauma cases from Salt River Mortuary. Globally, trauma is considered a common form of homicide, and in Cape Town, this is especially true where violence is rife. Blunt force trauma, as the name would suggest, are injuries sustained to the body when it comes into contact with a blunt object at great force. In terms of homicide, this is often as a result of an assault with blunt objects such as fists, feet, bats, or clubs. Nationally, however, there's a dearth of centralized information regarding blunt force trauma, and studies often use data in varying degrees from a variety of sources, such as police dockets, autopsy reports, and hospital records. Furthermore, the significance of the proportions reported in these studies is seldom reported, and the population data is often not included. Hence, the aim of my study was firstly to determine the prevalence of blunt force trauma in the Cape Metropole, and secondly, to describe the characteristics associated with these homicides. Our study was a retrospective review from the 1st of January to the 31st of December in 2013, and the prevalence of blunt force trauma was studied with a focus on homicide. The inclusion criteria were cases where the cause of death was blunt force trauma as determined by a pathologist, and cases where the victim showed signs of blunt and sharp force trauma were classified as combination cases, and then cases where death was caused by falling from a height, train-related, pedestrian, or motor vehicle accidents were excluded. In 2013, there were 3,346 cases at Salt River Mortuary, and of these, 247, or 7.4%, showed signs of blunt force trauma, with 183, or 5.5%, classified as homicide. In the Cape Metropole, this translates to a prevalence of 6.6 per 100,000 population for blunt force trauma and 4.89 per 100,000 population for blunt force trauma homicide. These figures were a bit less than we expected based on the previous South African studies, specifically by Lera et al. And Mazopoulos, who reported blunt force trauma to contribute to 13 and 14% of unnatural deaths, respectively. However, these cases did not focus solely on homicide and included all forms of blunt force trauma deaths, and also included motor vehicle accidents, which are known to contribute to the burden of health, especially in developing countries. Our age of the victims ranged from 0 to 81 years old, and the mean range of the victims was approximately 32 years old, with most of the victims falling within the 20 to 29-year age group. These results were in accordance with South African literature, but were younger than what was reported in international studies, and this is thought to be contributed to the high level of involvement of younger people in South Africa in gang violence and crime in general. We saw a significant difference in the distribution of the gender of the victims, with a male to female ratio of 14 to 1. Now, while it's globally as well as historically accepted that males are more at risk of homicide than females, our studies still showed an overrepresentation of males, because from the total intake of 2013 Salt River Mortuary, there were 77% males and 21% female victims. There was a significant association between the number of homicides and the days of the week, with Sunday contributing the most cases, a number of 42, which represents 23 of our total population. And what's more, the weekend accounted for 42% of the total number of cases, which is thought to be in part caused by people taking more time spending drinking on the weekends, which evidence for which was seen when Saturday and Sunday showed to have the highest number of cases of mild to severe intoxication. We saw no trend in the seasonal distribution of the cases, as is sometimes reported in international literature, but this wasn't so surprising based on the moderate climate in South Africa, as well as the overall high crime rate. 69% of our cases were exclusively blunt force trauma, and 41% of victims showed signs of blunt and sharp force trauma. There was a wide disparity in the degree of severity of the attacks, with the number of injuries per case ranging from 0 to 66, and the mean number of injuries per case being approximately 13. These injuries tended to be spread widely across the body and often affected more than one body region. The high number of injuries on the arms could be attributed to defensive wounds, but the head was shown most often to be affected by blunt force trauma, with 91% of the cases showing injury to the head and 16% of the cases showing injury only to the head. The physical context of the crime scene was the physical location in which the crime took place, and we categorized it into indoors, informal or informal housing or other, outdoors, and unknown locations. And the majority of the crimes took place in an outdoor context, which represented 51% of the total number of cases. But what was interesting to note was that when we analyzed the physical crime scene data separately for each gender, we saw a difference in the distribution of the cases. So what we found was that females tended to be killed indoors, with 42% of the total female population being killed in formal or informal housing, compared to the 12% of the male victims who were killed indoors, as they tended to be killed in an outdoor context. The reasons for this could be due to domestic violence, but further study would be required because of our small sample size. The Cape Flats contributed almost 67% of our total number of cases, which is 7 times more than the second most affected area, which was the City Bowl. Now, despite this staggering figure, it was not surprising based on the high rate of homicide, as well as the low socio-economic status of the Cape Flats. The blood alcohol concentration was measured in grams of alcohol per 100 mils, and we separated it into 5 groups, namely unknown, where no analysis was conducted, and then no signs of intoxication, signs of mild intoxication, which was based on the legal driving limit, intoxication, and severe intoxication. While the majority of cases had no alcohol analysis, of those which were analyzed, the majority of victims showed no sign of intoxication. And then the limitations of this study is that it's only conducted for a year period, which doesn't allow for comparison or the emergence of trends. However, because it's an ongoing study, as we progress, these will become evident. And then our population data was taken from the 2011 census from the district municipality of the city of Cape Town, which is a larger study area than the one we looked at. However, in future, if we were to include cases from Tygerberg Mortuary, we would cover the district municipality of the city of Cape Town. Our results broadly concur with those done in previous South African studies, and we saw that most victims were young males from the Cape Flats area. Now, with this research, we could help to better analyze or implement crime prevention strategies in that area. The head was shown to be the most affected body injury in blunt force fatal attacks, and this only highlights the importance and significance of focusing resources and research into cranial trauma. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Courtney. There was a lot of information to digest. There's some really interesting studies, some really interesting findings that complement each other. So I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions and comments that are going to follow from now. We've got quite a bit of time. We've got around about an hour for that. So I'm going to open the floor, and there's going to be a roving mic around. And then what I'd suggest is if we can just take a number of questions, and then we'll hand it back to the panel to answer those questions, and then we'll open the floor again for more questions if there are any. But just when you ask your question, please, if you can just identify yourself again, because there were there's a lot of people in the room, and the round of introductions, we kind of need to reinforce who we are. So let me open the floor. For those of you who want to speak, please put up your hands, and the gentleman with the mic. Have you got the mic? Okay. He will come to you. Okay. There's a question over there.
Thanks. Calvin Moore from the Division of Forensic Medicine. My question is for you, Mandy. I just wanted to find out, in your study, what area of the head did you find was mostly affected in terms of blunt force trauma? Because we know from the literature it seems that the lateral part of the head is most commonly affected in homicides, whereas the frontal portion is more affected in road traffic accidents. Just wanted to know if you looked at that and what you found. Thanks.
Thank you. There's another question about.
Marie Hines, Forensic Medicine, UCT. Mandy, question for you. The skulls that you have in your collection, do you ever use it to teach the students with? And could any of the damage that you see on the skulls be attributed to, shall we say, student handling?
There's a question here in front.
Yeah, thanks. Very nice presentations. So I'm interested in knowing more about the culprits, and the motive. I don't know if you've got that kind of data available, but it would be nice to know kind of some reasons for these deaths. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. There's a question, yes, at the back.
Thank you. I just heard the last speaker talk about no seasonal trends. Did you look at days before public holidays? Because in some of the data that I've seen, that comes out as a trend.
Thanks, Jean. One final question for this round. Over there.
My name is Marianne van der Schuren from the Center for Transport Studies, UCT. I would like to ask Courtney, you made a comparison between the age of your victims compared to international statistics. Did you take into account the South African statistics of the population?
Thanks. Let's just, take the first round, and we'll stop for the first round of questions now. I'm going to hand back to the speakers and give them an opportunity to respond, and then we'll open up for more questions after that. Can I start with you?
None of the questions were really directed at my presentation, but just in terms of perpetrator characteristics, that is not a limitation, but we just don't have access in terms of NIMS data. So those would be the types of information we would request from SAPS, but yes, that would be the way forward, would be to link NIMS to other sources like SAPS to make that link or the association with perpetrator typology.
Thank you.
Okay, Calvin, you asked about the facial bones as well as the skull. We found that 32% of the nasal bones were affected, and the frontal bone was only 23%, while the parietal bones was 19%, and zygomatic followed that. So nasal can be because of MVAs and as well as interpersonal violence. So that's why I didn't do a full assessment and say it was interpersonal violence. When it was frontal bone, it can be both as well, as parietal will be more because of interpersonal violence, especially parietal more to the dorsal side. But yeah, it was quite high, but not that high. Did I answer your question? Maurice, you said about the student handling. Yes, we did use it for students. Nothing is student-proof, you know that. And we looked at erosion versus healed modeling on the bones. So that's why we used the magnifying glass. So if there was only erosion, we excluded. If there was some healing, remodeling, then we included it.
Thanks. I didn't get the names of who asked the questions, but we didn't focus specifically on the days before public holidays. We tried to get a general trend of where would be a good place to look, and I think that's an interesting area to study further. And in terms of the age, we didn't look at the distribution of the ages of our population because, as with the previous question, this point of the study was to try and determine the general layout of blunt force trauma and what affects it. So that would also be an interesting area to look at as we go ahead with the research.
Thanks so much for that. Just a comment from my side in a response to the question that Simon asked about perpetrators and the culprits. I think it's many researchers in this field, and I think it's trauma surgeons see it a lot, is that often the distinction between perpetrator and victim when it's young man versus young man is often very fine. That the victim was actually he might have been an aggressor at the point of contact as well. So it's a tricky area. And I think we don't know as much about perpetrators as we do about victims, but sometimes the victim may actually have been a perpetrator in that crime as well, which contributes to the complexity thereof. I'd like to open it up for a second round of questions or comments. John, and then Leon at the back, and then table, and then Andrew.
Thanks. John Cartwright. A couple of observations. Speaking as an older white male, I was interested in that particular statistic about older white males being surprisingly heavily represented. And just speculating about that, I suppose the assumption is that older white males in this context are expected to be A, weakening and vulnerable, and B, well off. Neither of which is necessarily the case, I hasten to say, but I presume that may have something to do with being targeted. And the other comment, I just noticed, I think it came through on the Daily Maverick yesterday, some of you may have noticed, a report from the United States on the very surprising sudden rise in homicides across a range of cities in the United States, ranging from New York City, quite a small increase, to Milwaukee, a massive increase. And there's immediately, of course, a great deal of speculation about this. And one of the suggestions being that with a very wide availability of firearms, a tendency of young men to suddenly take to shooting, in an apparently trivial argument. And there's anecdotal suggestions of that from Milwaukee, for example, but it's quite a surprise after years of decline in homicide across the United States cities. Thanks.
Good morning, Leon Holtzhausen, Department of Social Development, UCT. I think part of my question is triggered by the question that was asked, I think it was by Simon, the relationship between the perpetrator and the data that we're seeing. So maybe it's a comment to the researchers in the room. Is there a way that we might be able to match up what we see, the data that we see in front of us, with connecting that to the perpetrator? Meaning, is there a way to follow that perpetrator when maybe they've been sentenced, and we could maybe interview them and look at some of the reasons why they engaged in this behavior, particularly, and linking it back to the trauma that we're seeing in front of us. So that's to the panel guy. Thanks.
Then there was at the table in the middle at the back. Hand up there.
Thank you. obviously being at the Center for Transport Studies, I do research into transport-related accident and fatalities. And in that, I have done a study previously where we looked at the number of the areas where perpetrators came from that were causing accidents and fatalities, and areas where there's high violent crime stats in the police stations, and there is an 80% relationship. So we didn't look at where the accidents happened, but where the drivers came from that caused those accidents. Other stats that I can share is that 75% of accidents are caused by males. Only 8% of females are causing fatal accidents. So if you look at fatalities, males are 92% of the cause of that.
Andrew Nicol over here, and then question in the front.
Good morning. Great research. I was just interested in the firearm mortality rates decreasing in Mpumalanga and Gauteng. So certainly over the last couple of years, we've been seeing the spike happening in patients presenting to us with gunshot wounds. So what are we doing wrong in the Western Cape? Is it gang-related? What's the difference between this our situation in Mpumalanga and Gauteng?
Hi, Roxanne Jacobs. This is a question for Mandy. Where did you find, where do the cadavers come from? Could it be that it is a special population that you're analyzing as a sample? Is it Jane Doe's or John Doe's that is picked up from the state because of violent incidents that succumb to whatever injuries? Or where do these skeletons come from? Could it have an influence on the majority of them being victims to trauma?
Thanks. I'm going to hand it back to the speakers to respond to the questions the best they can. Some of the questions were directed at them. Some of them were more general questions. So I'll start with their particular response, and then I'll open the floor for further conversations and see if there's any comments on questions such as that Leon raised about, how do we match up the data and understand more about perpetration of homicide and other forms of violence. Mandy, can I start with you, and then go to Courtney, and then
to answer your question, the cadavers are basically donated, although we do have quite a few coming from Jane Doe's or John Doe's. The big thing is that 87% of the records that we have shows that most of these cadavers are coming from low socioeconomic areas around the northern parts of the Western Cape. So it's mostly Tygerberg and then Kolbremmer. Those two hospitals are mostly the ones that's donated. And then Grooteskies is third. And the last residents of them are basically Cape Flats and Boland Dorpies, as well as the northern suburbs of the metropole. And as I said, low socioeconomic areas, yes. Other questions? We at Western Cape do have a lot of gang-related violence. I can't speak about stats. I'm not really clued up there, but I think the Western Cape has the big problem in the Cape Flats because of the young men that like to do violence.
In terms of the perpetrator information, our study focused on autopsy reports, and that information is not available in autopsy reports because obviously the perpetrator, if they are mentioned, it isn't legally that they've been accused. So you'd have to look in conjunction with the legal documents and then follow that case back to the autopsy report to get a good idea of the crimes that the perpetrators are committing. But you couldn't do it just with autopsy reports alone.
Yes, we have a similar situation with our data coming from forensic pathology services in Gauteng and Mpumalanga, so we don't have access to perpetrator information. So that would be a challenge. I'm thinking or speculating the only way, or one of the possible ways one could perhaps match up, is by case numbers if that is reported on the forensic report as well. But it will definitely, it is a challenge. And then in terms of white males emerging as being at high risk, that has been a divergent finding to previous studies from our data. I would like, just tentatively, because we didn't really unpack external cause across all of the different categories, but just a very crude look showed that sharp objects actually in the non-firearm category, those were the leading external mechanism of homicide, but that will need further investigation. And then in terms of the difference in the rates that we see in Western Cape versus Gauteng, Mpumalanga, I would have to concur with the gang involvement. Again, we were limited in how much we could say. So I don't want to make that leap, and because that wasn't the investigation, but that would be or how I would link or explain in part why we see that difference between the three provinces. And then also actually what I failed to mention was the Macroscopic 2014 paper. They linked it back to the Firearms Control Act of 2000, which might in part explain why we're seeing this decrease in homicide rate. But again, we need to be cautious with how much we read into that, because it needs to be linked at specific strategies or interventions and the role of NGOs as well, like Gun Free South Africa. So it needs to be contextualized before we can really make concluding remarks.
Thanks, Nancy. Just a couple of comments also from my side, just trying to fill in some of the gaps around the kind of questions. And there was this conversation about increases in, noticeable increases in firearm injuries that are being seen in trauma units. And it's around, we don't know enough about what's happening now, because we've seen this downward trend in firearm homicides and firearm injuries. But we look at the crime statistics over the past few years, we've actually seen a slight upswing in the murder rate, according to the police statistics. The crime stats are coming out later this month, so it'd be interesting to see if that trend continues. In the case of the Western Cape, a really interesting dynamic is it seems as though, from publicly available information, that the gangsters actually have to get their guns from Gauteng these days. That there's a big case happening in the Bellville Magistrates Court where in the Bellville High Court, where a police official who's been in the police for many, many years has been selling firearms that he had under his control in Vereniging to gangs, the 28th gang down here, to the mongrels down here. And the same around, there's a case going on with corruption involving the Central Firearm Registry, where gangs have somehow infiltrated the Central Firearm Registry and are accessing firearm licenses to get legal guns. So there's some sort of dynamic here, but I certainly think there's a lot of value in the nature of gangsterism and gang violence here, where there is a preference for firearms. And I think, throughout other parts of the world, and we see in other cities, maybe gangs prefer to use knives because they're more readily available. But in Cape Town, there is a particular value that's added to access to a firearm, and with that comes increased firearm violence. And we don't know enough about the dynamic of gangs within what's happening with gangs in the Western Cape at the moment. But if we just have to look at what happened in Manenberg in recent months, there's realignments, there's conflict, there's competition happening, and I think one needs to look at the nature of the drug trade, and all these kind of things are interlinked. So let me open it up again for an additional round of questions or comments if there are any more.
I actually have a question for Courtney. When you spoke about the outdoor context, what did that refer to? Was it in the streets, shebeens? What constituted outdoor context?
we refer to outdoor context as it was pretty much anywhere that was outdoors and not in the victim's own domicile. So the streets, roads. We didn't really go into the specifics of it because often it's not reported in the FPS information, and also because we just wanted to get a general idea. But it might be something to look into further as to actually where exactly they are. Yeah.
Just a response to that, because with NIMS data, we actually look at scene of injury, where we would collapse across either street, private parks, homes, etc. So it wasn't a focus for this paper, but that information is captured.
Any other questions, comments from the floor? I have two over here, at the second table and the table behind.
Thanks. Bronwyn Davies, forensic toxicologist for UCT and forensic pathology services. My question is to Nancy. Firstly, do you include any kind of blood alcohol and toxicological data in the NIMS system? And then you mentioned that you didn't have any BAC data with regards to your study, despite getting, I believe, a lot of that information from pathology services. So my question there is that why is that? First of all, I know you mentioned the backlog, but there was some information from Courtney's study, being either they weren't analyzed or there was some data. So going all the way back to 2007, is there some data available for that? And then really, just going back to the first one, is that available then in the NIMS system? And just as a general comment, I think internationally it's well recognized that drugs and alcohol do play a large role in violence and homicide. So this is some of the research that we're moving forward into at UCT as well, with regards to that. Yeah, thank you.
Was there a question on the table behind? A comment, yes.
Just with regards to the question about getting more information from the perpetrator or even the victim, the road probably that I would suggest one follows is that you get information from the forensic pathology autopsy reports. Then you have to drop a list of CAS numbers, put a proposal together, send it to the police research division, where they then will evaluate your proposal and give you permission to access the dockets or not. Unclosed dockets are a bit more difficult to get access to. And then you'll have to go and follow that docket numbers through to the court system and get copies of the verdicts if it has been closed. It's a long path, and it can be a difficult path, but it is one way of getting access to it.
Got a hand from John Cartwright over here.
So before we go there, I had my hand up. It's Lorna Martin, Head of Forensic Pathology at UCT. Just a comment on information that is available in terms of location and Courtney's study. That information is available, it just needs to be extracted. So the outside or inside in terms of location. And then also just to mention, and sorry I missed your presentation, Nancy, in the beginning, but the Western Cape doesn't contribute to NIMS. I don't know if you mentioned that in the beginning.
Yes, you did.
Thanks. Just following up on this outside and inside, some colleagues in the safety lab did some interesting work trying to figure out the relationship between, for example, shebeens, this was in Nyanga, and homicides. And they found it very useful to try and get access to the emergency medical services reporting, because where someone is picked up is noted, not necessarily where it happened. They may have been called to a certain place. Someone may, for example, have been stabbed inside or outside a shebeen and goes staggering off and is found somewhere at a considerable distance. So I think there's if one gets down into the detail, it gets in some ways more and more difficult to draw very convincing conclusions about the relationship between, about place and where the person has come from, where the person is found. And there's also the possibility, of course, of someone walking out of a place rather drunk and being followed and being assaulted in a conveniently dark corner down the road. So there's a lot of detail that one has to be, I think, aware of in this. Thanks.
Any other hands? Okay, I'm just going to hand it back to the panel for some final words, and then we're going to wrap up.
In response to the blood alcohol and toxicology data, at the moment for Gauteng and Mpumalanga, we're sitting with a backlog in laboratory testing. I need to follow up with the project leader, but we are expecting that data, but not anytime soon. But we will have to backtrack and then get the data retrospectively. But usually it has been available up till 2007. So data preceding that or findings preceding that from NIM studies do include blood alcohol data. And in terms of scene of injury, yes, I absolutely agree with that. We are cautious in how we interpret, like the profile in terms of scene of injury, because we found issues with data capturers, not necessarily collecting the correct information. So scene of injury might not be the same as, or the scene of where the body was picked up was not necessarily the same as scene of injury. So we are aware of that.
Just the comment, Maurice. I think we should have put a master's student on accessing the dockets, and then we can find the info.
Thanks. In terms of the outdoor context again, with my study, we looked at so many different characteristics that we weren't able to unpack each one as much as there is potential to do. So I think what we wanted to really achieve is to see which areas we would like to unpack. And I think the outdoor context is one where you can do a whole study on it, especially because sometimes the victim will die in hospital and then that scene of injury isn't recorded. So you'd have to go then into the police docket and witnesses and that kind of thing. And then in terms of the reported information, as Lorna was saying, it is present, but some go into more detail than others. So that's why we didn't want to comment on it too much in terms of the specificities of the outdoor context, because some will say the street number and the name and everything, and others will just say outdoor in the road. So we thought it was best to just do an umbrella term of outdoor, and then if we wanted to subsequently investigate, then to do so.
Well, I'd like to thank our panelists. It's been a really good start to this colloquium. We've had some clear and really insightful presentations, and there's been some good conversations. I know it's been fairly early in the morning. The other positive thing is we've gained a bit of time, so we're about half an hour ahead of schedule, which is a positive thing because our next panel is a bit jam-packed. We have 4 presentations in that panel. So what I'd like to suggest is that we break for tea, coffee now, and we come back at 10:30 for the second panel that Amanda Dissel from Department of Community Safety will be chairing for us. Lamise, do you have anything from a technical side? Okay, so tea, coffee is in the room next door. Please help yourself. There's also a balcony outside that you can go and stand on in the sunshine. Thank you.